Why do master Japanese carpenters reach for tools that look almost like the ones hanging in your shop, and yet get results out of them that you cannot? Because each of those tools does one specific thing your Western version does not, and once you see what that one thing is, you cannot unsee it. I have run a garage shop for more than 25 years, and I came up entirely on Western tools, the ones at the home center. They work. But the deeper I got into Japanese hand tools, the more I realized a lot of them are not just a different flavor of the same thing. They solve a problem my tools quietly leave unsolved. Stay with me to the end, because the last tool on this list is older than the hand plane itself. It still gets used restoring temples in Japan, and almost no Western woodworker has ever held one. And right in the middle is a tool that looks exactly like something you already own, until you flip it over and find a hidden scale that does math for you that most of us reach for a calculator to solve. Start with the one you would swear you already own, the hammer. In Japan it is called a genno. Pick one up and it looks like a simple steel hammer with a head on a handle, nothing special. Then you look at the two striking faces, and the secret is hiding in plain sight. One face is dead flat, for general work. The other face is very slightly domed, crowned just a hair, curved by maybe a few thousandths of an inch, less than the thickness of a sheet of paper. That tiny dome is not a defect, it is the whole point. When you drive a nail or a peg the last little bit, you switch to the domed face, and because only the center of the dome touches, you can set that fastener perfectly flush, or even a hair below the surface, without the rim of the hammer face stamping a bruised ring into the wood around it. You have seen those little half-moon dents around a nail in your own work. That is a flat Western hammer face, catching the wood on the final blow. The genno's domed face erases that problem entirely. Same swing, no bruise. A common size runs around 375 grams in the head, about the weight of a full soda can, heavy enough to drive a chisel but controlled enough to finish a nail, and a decent one is about $35. You use the flat face for almost everything, and save that domed face for the last tap, the one that seats the fastener home. I owned a claw hammer for 30 years, and left those little moon dents around every nail without once asking why. I thought that was just what hammers did. It is not. It is what a flat face does on the final blow. And 100 years ago, a Japanese blacksmith already had the answer forged into the other end of the head. That is a lot of thought poured into a hammer, and it tells you how these people think. Nothing is just good enough. Every tool is aimed at the surface staying perfect. And that is the lens to watch these next 9 through, because once you see it in the hammer, you start seeing it everywhere, in tools you thought you already understood. The second tool is the one that will surprise you most, because it looks identical to a tool already hanging on your wall. The sashigane, the Japanese framing square. It is a thin, flexible steel L, and at a glance it is just a square. Flip it over. On the back are scales that are not on your Western square, and they do math for you. There is a scale called the kakume, and it is graduated at the square root of 2, which is about 1.41 times the normal spacing. What that does is this. You lay the square across the end of a round log, read the diameter on that kakume scale, and the number it gives you is the size of the largest square timber you can cut out of that log. No formula, no calculator, the scale did the geometry. There is a second scale, the marume, that reads circumference straight off the diameter, and there is one more piece of genius. The blade is profiled so that its marking edge lifts just slightly off the wood, which means when you run ink along it, the ink cannot bleed underneath and smear your line. A Western square lies flat and wicks ink under the edge. The sashigane was designed so that cannot happen. Run the log example so it lands. You have a round log and you want the biggest square post you can saw out of it. Lay the kakume scale across the diameter, and say it reads 30. That number is your answer directly. The largest square inside that log is 30 units on a side, and you never touched a calculator or the Pythagorean theorem, even though that is exactly the math it is doing for you. The blade is also thin and flexible, only about as thick as a couple of credit cards, so you can bend it against a curved surface to mark a line where a rigid Western square would just rock and lie to you. A good Shinwa sashigane is around $25. The Japan Woodcraft Association and the Takanaka Carpentry Tools Museum both document these scales going back centuries. So this is not some modern gimmick stamped on for show. It is how carpenters actually sized timber before anyone carried a tape. The same square lays out angles and roof pitches too, using those scales to step off a rafter without ever calculating a single angle in degrees. A Japanese carpenter reads geometry off that L of steel, the way you read a tape measure, and it took me a long time to appreciate that the tool I dismissed as a plain square was quietly the most sophisticated thing in the old carpenter's kit. Sit with that a second. A carpenter 400 years ago built the square root of 2 into a ruler, so a man in the forest could size a beam from a round log in his head. That is not primitive, that is elegant. Third on the list goes right with that square, and it is how the old carpenters actually made their marks. It is a pair, the sumitsubo and the sumisashi. The sumitsubo is an ink pot with a line running through it, and you snap that line to lay a dead straight reference across a long or rough timber, exactly like your chalk line, except this tradition is centuries older. The sumisashi is the pen, and it is just a piece of split bamboo you shape yourself. One end is worked into a thin, flexible spatula for drawing lines, and the other into a point for writing symbols and layout marks. This is why it beats a pencil. Ink from that bamboo pen shows up crisp and dark on rough sawn, dark, oily, or even damp timber, the exact surfaces where a pencil skates, smears, or disappears. And because it is ink laid on the surface, it never dents the wood the way you crush a line in with a hard pencil. The real craftsmen split the writing end into dozens of fine tines, 30 or 40 of them across a half-inch, about the width of a couple of pencil leads, so it holds ink like a brush. On rough construction timber, the sumisashi draws a clean, readable line, where nothing else will, and the best part is, you make the pen yourself from a scrap of bamboo for nothing. Fourth is a marking gauge, and again you own a version of it, and again the Japanese one does one thing yours does not. It is called a kebiki. A marking gauge is a tool with a fence that slides along the edge of a board and a cutter that scribes a line a fixed distance in, so you can mark, say, the thickness of a tenon all the way down a board perfectly parallel to the edge. The common Western gauge uses a pin, a little spike, to scratch that line. The kebiki uses a small knife blade instead. That difference is everything. A pin dragged across the grain tears a ragged, fuzzy furrow. A knife blade slices the fibers cleanly and leaves a crisp walled groove, even going across the grain, and that clean wall is exactly what your chisel drops into for a tight joint. It is the same knife line idea I hammered on in an earlier video, just built into a sliding gauge so every line runs dead parallel to the edge. A good Japanese kebiki is around $30, and it is the fastest way to see your joints tighten up. Fifth is the knife itself, and in a Japanese shop it is the one that never leaves the bench. It is called a kiridashi. It is a small knife ground with a single bevel, meaning it is flat on one whole face and angled only on the other, and that flat back is the trick. You lay the flat back tight against a straight edge or a square, and the knife rides right along it and cuts your line exactly where the steel is, with no wandering. The pointed tip handles all the fine work too, whittling a peg to fit, cleaning out the corner of a joint, trimming a sliver. It is layout knife, detail knife, and utility knife in one flat little blade, and once one is in your hand you reach for it 50 times a day. One thing to know when you buy one, and it is around $15 to $25, is that a single bevel knife is ground for a right or a left hand, because the flat side has to face the straight edge. Buy the one that matches your hand, or the flat back ends up on the wrong side and it fights you. I learned that by ordering the wrong one and wondering for a week why my lines drifted. We are about at the halfway point, and the thread tying all of this together is simple. None of these tools is magic, and none of them is exotic for its own sake. Each one was refined over centuries to solve one specific, real problem: the bruise around the nail, the math on the log, the line that smears, the furrow that tears. That is why they are worth knowing, even if you never buy a single one. They teach you what good actually looks like. Sixth is where the joinery actually gets cut, the chisel, or in the nomi family, the mortise chisel, called an atsunomi. A mortise is the square hole that a tenon, the matching tongue, fits into, and chopping a deep one is brutal on a chisel. The Japanese mortise chisel is built for exactly that beating. It is thick and stout. It has a steel hoop ringed around the top of the wooden handle, so the handle cannot split when you drive it with the geno, and the blade is laminated, meaning a thin layer of very hard steel is forge welded onto a softer iron body. The hard steel takes a wicked edge. The soft iron behind it absorbs the shock and is easy to sharpen. A half-inch mortise chisel, about the width of 2 stacked pencils, is the common size, and you work by driving it straight down along your knife line, levering the waist up, moving back a bit, and driving again, walking down the mortise in steps. A good one runs $40 to $60, because there is real hand forging in it. It is a chisel built to be hit hard for a lifetime and stay sharp, and it is a different animal from the thin bench chisels most of us start with. Notice a pattern building across these tools. The hammer protects the surface. The square does the math. The gauge cuts instead of tears. The chisel is built to be beaten and stay keen. Every one is a small refusal to accept good enough, and that is the real thing worth stealing here, not the tool, the standard behind it. The 7th entry is not one tool but a family, the specialty kana, the Japanese planes. Everybody has seen the flat Japanese smoothing plane, the one you pull toward you instead of pushing, that takes shavings you can read a newspaper through, a couple thousandths of an inch thick, thinner than a human hair. What most people never see are its cousins, and this is where hand finishing gets serious. The kiwakana is a rabbit plane, meaning its blade runs right out to the very edge so it can plane straight into an inside corner where a normal plane cannot reach. The sokozarai kana is a tiny plane that cleans out the flat bottom of a groove or a recess, doing by hand what a router plane does. And there are planes with curved soles, rounded and hollowed, that smooth a concave or a convex curve perfectly. One thing Western woodworkers underestimate is that the body of these planes is wood, called the die, and part of the craft is tuning that wooden sole flat, so the plane is half tool and half ongoing project. And none of these planes does a thing without a truly sharp blade, which ties back to the sharpening idea I keep coming back to, that the edge does the work and a dull one just tears. A kana blade honed on water stones until it will shave the hair off your arm is what makes those tissue-thin shavings possible. A dull one just chatters and skips. With that family on the bench, a Japanese craftsman finishes shaped and jointed work to a polish with no sandpaper anywhere in sight. 8th solves a problem that has probably stopped you cold before. It is the azabiki nokogiri. A normal saw can only start a cut from the edge of a board, because the blade is straight and long. The azabiki is a small saw, the blade only about 4 inches, roughly the length of a stubby carpenter's pencil, with short curved cutting edges that bow out slightly, and that curve lets you drop the teeth down into the middle of a board and start a cut right there in the field, nowhere near an edge. Think about what that opens up. You can saw the walls of a stopped groove, cut a slot in the center of a panel, or define the edges of a pocket for an inlay, all starting from a spot no straight saw could ever reach. You rough it in with the azabiki, and clean it up with a chisel. Picture setting a diamond-shaped wooden inlay into the middle of a tabletop. With a straight saw you cannot even begin the cut without running off the edge. With the azabiki you drop in right at the layout line, saw the 4 walls of the pocket, and pare it clean, all in the field of the panel where no other saw can start. One runs about $35, and it is a small saw that does the one thing you always wished your saw could do. 9th is the one that makes the surface you have seen and admired without knowing its name. It is the chona, the Japanese adze. An adze is a bladed tool swung like a hoe, with the cutting edge set across the end of the handle instead of in line with it, and it is used to hew a rough log or beam down toward size, taking off big controlled bites. This is a swing it toward your own feet tool, so it earns real respect and it is not one you learn casually. But the part you have actually seen is this. A skilled hand with a chona leaves a rippled, dimpled, faceted surface called naguri, and that hand-hewn texture has become a signature look on exposed timber beams, and, lately, on high-end shelves, benches, and tabletops. It is a texture no machine reproduces, because it comes from a person reading the wood and swinging a blade, and it is having a real moment in modern furniture right now. The first time my wife saw a niguri shelf, she asked why I would beat up a perfectly smooth board on purpose. That reaction, the double take, is exactly why designers are charging a premium for it. Now the 10th tool, the one I held for the end, because it is older than the hand plane, older than most of what we call woodworking tools, and almost no woodworker in the West has ever put their hands on one. It is the yarigana, the spear plane. Before the block plane with its flat sole existed in Japan, this is the tool that finished wood. It is a long handle with a leaf-shaped, spear-shaped blade on the end. And instead of running a flat sole across the board, you draw that curved blade over the surface in long strokes, shaving it smooth by feel and skill alone. It takes real practice, because there is no flat sole registering the cut for you. Your hands are the only guide. So why does it still get used, centuries after the flat plane replaced it? Because on the great old temples of Japan, when craftsmen restore the ancient woodwork, they finish it with the yarigana to match the original, and that surface is not dead flat and glassy like a machine leaves. It is subtly faceted, a series of shallow scooped facets that catch the light, and that faceted surface actually sheds water and weathers more gracefully than a perfectly flat one. Think about why that matters on a temple. Those surfaces sit exposed to rain and sun for centuries, in the humid Japanese climate, and a dead flat machined face holds a sheet of water against the wood, while a gently faceted one breaks that water up and lets it run and dry. The old builders did not have a lab to prove it. They watched buildings last 1,000 years and kept doing what worked. Temple restoration crews in Japan still keep yarigana specialists on hand for exactly this reason, because a modern plane cannot match the original surface. It is the oldest tool on this list, and in some ways the most advanced idea on it, that a surface with a little life in it lasts longer than a surface machined dead flat. There is a fair warning with that one, and with a few of these. The yarigana is not a beginner tool, and not even most experts in the West have the years it takes to master it. I am not telling you to run by a spear plane and expect a temple finish next weekend. I tried one myself. I got a blade, watched the masters do it, and my first pass looked less like a temple finish and more like a beaver had gotten to the board. That is not the tool's fault. It is decades of skill living in a person's hands, and I have nothing but respect for the few who still have it. And a couple of these, the framing square, the ink line, the marking gauge, do have Western cousins that work fine, so nobody needs to feel their tools are junk. There is also a real cost of ownership nobody mentions. Japanese laminated steel is harder than most Western tool steel, which is why it takes such a keen edge, but that same hardness makes it a little more brittle, so you do not pry or lever hard with a fine Japanese chisel, or you can chip that edge. And that carbon steel rusts fast, so in a humid shop, a garage on the Gulf Coast, you wipe your blades with a light oil, or they spot overnight, where out in a dry climate you can be lazier about it. These are tools that ask a little care back from you. The point is not that your tools are bad. The point is that the Japanese version of each was refined to solve one specific problem yours leaves on the table. And knowing what that problem is makes you better even with the tools you already own. That is really the secret Western woodworkers are missing. It is not that these 10 tools are magic. It is the mindset behind them, that every single tool should be aimed at one real problem and refined until it solves it completely. The bruise, the smear, the tear, the surface. Buy one if you want. A Kiridashi knife or a Japanese marking gauge is cheap, and it will change how clean your lines are this weekend. If you are going to dip a toe in, that is exactly where I would start. The knife and the gauge. Because together, they are under $50, and they upgrade the one thing that decides every joint, your layout. Skip the exotic stuff at first. You do not need a spear plane or an adze to feel the difference this thinking makes. Or buy none of them at all, and just carry the mindset back to your own bench. That a tool should aim at one real problem and solve it completely. Next time I want to take 2 of these, the pull saw and the chisel, and actually cut a Japanese joint with them start to finish, so you can see the difference land in your own hands. Go make some sawdust.